History usually remembers the conquerors, the armies that marched forward, the empires that expanded, the victories that reshaped maps. But sometimes, history remembers something else. Not a conquest, not an invasion, but a stand. A moment when a small group of defenders refused to move, a defensive stand that became legendary. At first light, the valley looked calm. Cold air drifted between the hills. Mist clung to the rocks. The narrow pass ahead seemed quiet, almost peaceful. It was the kind of place travelers crossed without noticing. But that morning, it would become something else, because this narrow strip of land was the only road forward, and a small force stood directly in its path. They weren't many, a few thousand at most, tired, undersupplied, far from home. Behind them lay their towns, their families, everything they had sworn to protect. Ahead of them, an army, a massive one. When the enemy banners appeared on the horizon, the scale became clear. Lines of soldiers stretched endlessly across the valley floor. Armor flashed in the sunlight. Drums echoed off the cliffs. The ground itself seemed to shake beneath their movement. Anyone looking at the two sides would have reached the same conclusion. This wouldn't be a battle. It would be a massacre. Even some of the defenders knew it. But they didn't run, because retreat meant surrender, and surrender meant everything behind them would burn. So instead of preparing to win, they prepared to hold. The commanders studied the terrain carefully. The pass was narrow, rocky, uneven, perfect. Only a small number of attackers could advance at once. The rest would be forced to wait behind, useless. Numbers would lose their meaning here. If they stood together, if they stayed disciplined, they might survive. That was enough. Shields were raised, lines were formed, shoulder to shoulder, no gaps, no fear allowed. No one spoke loudly. There were no heroic speeches, only quiet understanding. This wasn't about glory, it was about time. When the enemy finally advanced, they came with confidence. Why wouldn't they? They outnumbered the defenders many times over. To them, this was just another obstacle, something to crush quickly before moving forward. The first wave charged aggressively. Boots thundered. War cries filled the air. From a distance it looked unstoppable, like a flood rushing toward a wall of stone. And then, impact. Steel slammed into shields. The sound exploded through the pass, but the wall did not break. The defenders held, feet dug into dirt, shields locked tight. The charge stopped dead. The attackers behind kept pushing forward, unaware that the front had stalled. Pressure built instantly. Soldiers crushed into each other, weapons tangled, movement slowed. Their numbers became a problem, not an advantage. The defenders didn't waste energy. They didn't chase. They simply stood. When one soldier tired, another replaced him. When one shield cracked, another filled the gap. Every motion calm, every action controlled. They fought like a single body. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. The enemy attacked again and again, each time louder, each time more desperate, each time failing. Frustration spread through the larger army. How could so few still stand? Why wasn't the line breaking? Orders became confused. Units collided. Commanders shouted different commands. The noise grew, but coordination vanished. Chaos replaced strength. Meanwhile, the defenders remained quiet, disciplined, steady. They weren't stronger. They weren't faster. They were simply organized, and organization outlasts aggression. Fatigue began to spread through the attackers. Heavy armor weighed more with every step. Arms slowed. Morale cracked. Every failed push drained their confidence. The defenders, fighting shorter controlled bursts, conserved energy. They rested when they could, rotated positions, trusted the formation. This wasn't a fight to destroy the enemy. It was a fight to survive them. By late afternoon, something changed. The attack slowed. The shouting faded. For the first time, hesitation appeared in the enemy ranks. Doubt had arrived, and doubt is more dangerous than any weapon, because once an army stops believing it can win, it already hasn't. Then came the moment no one expected. The enemy began stepping back, slowly, reluctantly, a few soldiers first, then more, then entire groups pulling away, the unstoppable force retreating. The defenders didn't cheer, didn't chase, didn't break formation. They simply watched, because discipline had protected them all day. Discipline would protect them now. When the last enemy banners disappeared beyond the hills, the battlefield fell silent. The small force still stood, exhausted, bruised, but alive. They hadn't conquered anything. They hadn't destroyed the enemy. They had simply refused to fall, and sometimes that is enough. News of the stand spread quickly, across villages, across kingdoms, across history itself. People didn't remember how many attackers there were. They remembered something else. They remembered the line that didn't break, the shields that didn't fall, the defenders who chose to stand when retreat seemed easier. Because there is something powerful about survival against impossible odds, something unforgettable. They didn't win through strength. They didn't win through numbers. They won through discipline, unity, and the refusal to surrender. And that is why, long after the empires faded and the armies disappeared, that day is still remembered, not as a battle, but as a stand, a defensive stand, that became legendary. The armies that marched forward, the empires that expanded, the generals who claimed new lands and carved their names into maps. Victories are loud. They are easy to remember. But sometimes history remembers something quieter, not an invasion, not a conquest, but a stand. A moment when a small group of exhausted defenders refused to move and changed everything. This was one of those moments. At first light, the valley looked harmless. Cold air drifted between the hills. Thin mist clung to the rocks. A narrow mountain pass cut through the terrain like a scar, barely wide enough for a few hundred men to march side by side. Travelers crossed it every day without a second thought. But on this morning, it would decide the fate of thousands, because that narrow strip of land was the only road forward, and a small force stood directly in its path. They weren't many, a few Thusa, ND, at most. Their armor was worn, their supplies were low, many hadn't slept properly in days. Some carried scars from earlier fights. These were not fresh soldiers marching toward glory. These were tired men preparing to survive. Behind them lay their homes, their families, their farms, their children, everything they loved. Ahead of them came an army. When the enemy banners appeared on the horizon, the scale became terrifyingly clear. Lines of soldiers stretched across the valley floor farther than the eye could see. Thousands upon thousands. Sunlight flashed off endless helmets and spear tips. Drums thundered like approaching storms. The ground trembled beneath their march. It didn't look like an army. It looked like a moving wall. Anyone watching would have reached the same conclusion. The defenders didn't stand a chance. Even some of them quietly believed it. But retreat wasn't an option, because retreat meant opening the road, and opening the road meant destruction for everyone behind them. So instead of preparing to win, they prepared to hold. Their commanders studied the terrain carefully. The pass was narrow and uneven, bordered by steep rock walls. Only a small number of attackers could engage at once. The rest would be trapped behind their own men, unable to fight. Here, numbers would lose their meaning. Here, discipline would matter more than strength. Orders spread quietly down the line, shields locked, spears angled forward, shoulder to shoulder. No gaps, no panic. There were no heroic speeches, no dramatic promises of victory, just silent understanding. They weren't fighting for glory, they were fighting for time. When the my finally advanced, they came with confidence. Why wouldn't they? They outnumbered the defenders many times over. To them, this was nothing more than a small obstacle on the road to conquest, something to crush quickly and forget. The first wave charged, boots thundered, war cries echoed through the cliffs, dust rose into the sky. From a distance, it looked unstoppable, like a flood rushing toward a fragile wall. And then, impact. Steel slammed into shields with a deafening crash. The entire pass shook, but the wall did not break. The defenders held. Feet dug into the dirt, arms locked tight, shields pressed together like stone blocks. Not one soldier stepped back. The charge stopped instantly. Behind the front ranks, thousands of attackers kept pushing forward, unaware that the line had stalled. Pressure built fast. Soldiers crushed into each other. Weapons tangled. Movement became impossible. Their greatest strength became their greatest weakness. They had too many men, and nowhere to put them. The defenders didn't waste energy chasing or striking wildly. They stayed calm. When one man tired, another stepped forward. When one shield cracked, another filled the gap. Every movement precise, every action controlled. They fought like a single body instead of separate men. Hours passed. The enemy attacked again and again, each time louder, each time more desperate, each time failing. Frustration began spreading through the larger army. Officers shouted conflicting orders. Units pushed too early. Others hesitated. Formation disappeared. Chaos replaced confidence. Meanwhile, the defenders barely spoke. They conserved breath. They conserved strength. They trusted the line. They understood something the attackers didn't. Battles aren't always won by who hits harder. They're won by who lasts longer. By midday, exhaustion weighed heavily on the attackers. Heavy armor burned their shoulders. Arms trembled. Throats went dry. Every failed assault drained morale. The defenders, rotating positions and fighting in short bursts, remained steady. They weren't stronger. They were simply smarter. Then something subtle happened. The noise began to fade. The shouting weakened. For the first time, hesitation appeared in the enemy ranks. Doubt. And doubt is deadlier than any blade. Because once an army starts questioning itself, strength disappears. A few attackers step back, then a few more, then entire groups, the unstoppable force, retreating. The defenders didn't cheer, didn't chase recklessly, didn't break formation. Discipline had protected them all day. Discipline would protect them now. They simply held their ground and watched as the massive army slowly withdrew down the valley. When the last banner vanished beyond the hills, silence returned to the pass. The small force still stood, bruised, exhausted, but alive. They hadn't conquered anything. They hadn't destroyed their enemy. They had simply refused to fall. And sometimes, survival is the greatest victory of all. News of the stand spread far beyond the valley. People didn't talk about how many enemies there were. They talked about something else. They talked about the line that didn't break, the shields that never fell, the soldiers who chose to stand when logic said they should run. Because courage is memorable, but discipline is legendary. They didn't win through strength. They didn't win through numbers. They won through unity, patience, and control. And that is why this moment still lives on in memory, not as a conquest, not as an empire, but as something rarer, a defensive stand that became legendary.